When most people think of the Nazi concentration camps, names like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald come to mind. These camps became symbols of industrialized death, etched into history as places where millions perished. But there was another camp, one not often spoken of, yet it carried horrors of its own. Its name was Ravensbrück, and it was different. This was the only major concentration camp built specifically for women. Hidden in the pine forests of northern Germany, near a quiet lake, Ravensbrück seemed almost out of place. At first glance, the surrounding landscape appeared calm, even peaceful. But behind its electrified fences and gray barracks, a world of torment unfolded. 30,000 women from over 40 countries would pass through its gates between 1939 and 1945. Most would never leave. The women sent here were not all the same. They were Jews, Romani women, political prisoners, resistance fighters, social outcasts, and even children. Some were guilty of nothing more than speaking out against the regime or belonging to the wrong race. Others were foreigners dragged in from occupied territories. The camp became a melting pot of suffering, where mothers, daughters, and sisters shared the same fate. The Nazis had a very specific reason for creating Ravensbrück. Women were not just prisoners, they were seen as tools, resources, and even test subjects. The SS believed that controlling and exploiting women was just as important to their war effort as enslaving men in labor camps. And in Ravensbrück, the cruelty had a gendered edge. Conditions in the camp were deliberately designed to break the human spirit. Prisoners lived crammed together in wooden barracks, often 3 women to a single bunk. Food was scarce, consisting of watery soup and a crust of bread that could never sustain life for long. Disease spread quickly. Lice and fleas infested everything. The winter cold seeped through the thin walls, leaving women to shiver through endless nights. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing part of Ravensbrück was not just the starvation, disease, or beatings. It was what came later, the experiments, the forced labor, and the unthinkable methods of dehumanization that the Nazis carried out specifically on women. Still, in those first months after the camp opened in 1939, most of the world had no idea it even existed. While newspapers wrote about Hitler's invasions, the silent suffering of tens of thousands of women inside Ravensbrück remained in the shadows. Few could imagine that this camp hidden among the trees would become one of the darkest symbols of Nazi cruelty. And the question that lingers is chilling. Why women? Why did the Nazis create an entire camp devoted to their imprisonment and suffering? That answer lies in the twisted ideology of the regime, and the story of Ravensbrück is only beginning. When the train screeched to a halt outside Ravensbrück, the women inside were already broken by hunger, cold, and fear. But the real horror began the moment they stepped off. German guards with snarling dogs forced them into lines. Each woman was ordered to hand over her belongings, jewelry, clothing, even family photos. In that instant, their past lives were erased. They were marched to a processing room where they were stripped naked. Heads were shaved, and their clothes replaced with thin, striped uniforms. Any sense of dignity was deliberately crushed. The women were no longer names, they became numbers. Each prisoner was assigned a cloth triangle that marked her category: political, criminal, Jewish, Romani, or a social. These symbols dictated not only how they were treated, but also how long they were expected to survive. The camp guards, many of them women from the SS, showed no mercy. Survivor testimonies describe how guards laughed while humiliating the new arrivals. The sound of boots, the smell of burning coal, and the cold slap of winter air created a sensory nightmare that etched itself into memory. The new prisoners quickly learned the camp's unspoken rule. Survival meant silence, obedience, and invisibility. Any hesitation during roll call, any glance that seemed defiant, could result in a beating. Some were dragged to punishment cells, where they were left without food or forced to stand in freezing conditions for hours. For the women who arrived with children, the torment was worse. Infants were often torn from their mothers' arms. Some were sent to other camps for special treatment, while others were left to die from neglect. The psychological wounds of these separations were as deep as the physical scars of hunger and abuse. The camp was not designed simply to hold women, it was meant to break them, to strip them of humanity until they were tools of labor, or worse, subjects of experimentation. And yet, even in those first days, a dark question lingered in the air. Why had so many women been sent here specifically? Ravensbrück was unlike other camps. It wasn't just a prison. It was a hidden laboratory for cruelty. Life in Ravensbrück was designed to erase dignity. The prisoners were herded into overcrowded wooden barracks, often holding 2 or 3 times their intended capacity. Straw mattresses infested with lice were the only bedding. Sanitation was almost non-existent. A handful of latrines had to serve hundreds of women, and disease spread rapidly. Typhus outbreaks claimed countless lives, and the stench of sickness and death lingered constantly in the air. Food was another weapon of control. Women received watery turnip soup, stale bread, and sometimes thin coffee that offered no nourishment. Malnutrition weakened them, leaving them too frail to resist the forced labor that awaited them each day. The prisoners' bodies shrank, their ribs showing through paper-thin skin. Hunger gnawed at them endlessly, and survival often meant stealing crumbs or trading scraps under the watch of brutal guards. The SS guards enforced order through humiliation and violence. Beatings were common for the smallest mistakes. A woman standing too slowly, speaking without permission, or collapsing from exhaustion. Many were forced to line up for roll call for hours in freezing temperatures, standing motionless until their legs gave way. Even then, guards dragged them upright again, prolonging their suffering. What set Ravensbrück apart was not just the cruelty of the guards, but also the unique torment women endured because of their gender. Mothers had their children torn from them, and many newborns were killed on sight, often by neglect. Pregnant women were sometimes forced into labor until they collapsed, or sent directly to the gas chambers once the SS deemed them unfit to work. The psychological scars of these losses were as brutal as the physical abuse. Another layer of torment came from within. Prisoners were forced to turn on one another, some chosen as capos to oversee their fellow inmates. A position that offered slightly better rations, but demanded cruelty to survive. Trust was shattered, and betrayal became common. In this environment, hope itself became dangerous, a fragile light that the SS tried constantly to extinguish. But even in this manufactured hell, traces of resistance emerged. Women whispered songs, exchanged poems, and secretly passed along scraps of news from the outside world. These small acts of defiance kept alive a sense of humanity, even when the Nazis tried to strip it away. Yet the suffering at Ravensbrück was not limited to forced labor and deprivation. What truly set it apart in the history of Nazi camps were the medical experiments that began in its walls. Experiments that would soon plunge its prisoners into horrors beyond comprehension. At Ravensbrück, cruelty was not limited to forced labor or starvation. Some of the most disturbing chapters of the camp's history came from experiments carried out in the name of science. SS doctors and surgeons, often accompanied by young German medical students, selected women, mostly Polish political prisoners, for horrifying medical trials. These women became known inside the camp as the rabbits. They were not called this as a term of affection, but because they were treated like laboratory animals. Doctors deliberately infected their legs with bacteria to simulate battlefield wounds. They cut open flesh, inserted glass, wood splinters, and dirt to test how wounds became infected. Some women were forced to endure experimental amputations, as Nazi surgeons studied bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. Others were subjected to bone transplants, limbs cut apart and reassembled with no anesthesia or real medical purpose. Many of these experiments left women crippled for life, unable to walk, stand, or even move without pain. The victims were told these experiments were for the good of German soldiers fighting on the front lines. But the truth was far darker. Many procedures had little scientific merit. They were performed to satisfy curiosity or to give young doctors experience without regard for the suffering of the women. Survivors later testified that the operating rooms were filthy, the tools often unclean, and that wounds were stitched closed with coarse thread as if the victims were objects, not people. The psychological torment was just as severe as the physical. Prisoners who knew they had been marked for experiments often lived in terror, waiting for the day their number was called. Some women tried to hide their injuries or deformities afterward, fearing they would be executed to erase the evidence of Nazi crimes. Others resisted in quiet ways, smuggling notes out to the outside world to alert the Polish resistance about what was happening. Not all of the rabbits survived. Many died on the operating table, or later from infection and gangrene. Those who lived carried scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. Yet their suffering would eventually become some of the most important evidence used at the Nuremberg trials to expose the brutality of Nazi medical crimes. For the guards and doctors at Ravensbrück, the women were not human beings. They were seen as disposable subjects for research. But for the survivors, every scar told a story of endurance, and every secret note smuggled out was an act of defiance. And while the experiments marked the darkest part of the camp's story, the horrors at Ravensbrück were not confined to laboratories. Soon another nightmare unfolded, the transformation of the camp into a death factory, where thousands would never return. Ravensbrück was not just a prison. It became a laboratory of human suffering. Beginning in 1942, Nazi doctors turned some prisoners into unwilling test subjects. They've called it medical research. But what happened inside those sterile white rooms was nothing less than torture disguised as science. Women were injected with diseases to see how infections would spread. Some were cut open, their muscles and bones deliberately damaged, then treated with untested methods to test recovery. Others were forced to endure chemical burns so new drugs could be tested. Many died in agony. Those who survived carried scars on their bodies and in their minds that never healed. One group of prisoners, mostly young Polish women, became known as the rabbits. They were chosen because they were healthy and strong, which made them ideal subjects. The Nazis cut into their legs, inserted wood, glass, or bacteria, and then studied the results. The women resisted silently, supporting each other with songs and whispered prayers. Some were executed when they could no longer walk. Others survived, but the experiments left them crippled for life. The doctors claimed they were advancing medicine for soldiers on the front lines, but in truth, it was about power. To the Nazis, these women were not human beings. They were tools. The cruelty was systematic, designed to strip away dignity and reduce people to numbers on a clipboard. Word of the experiments spread inside the camp. Prisoners lived in constant terror, fearing that they would be chosen next. Many tried to hide injuries, hoping to avoid the medical ward. Others prayed for quick death rather than a slow one under a surgeon's knife. The rabbits became symbols of resistance. Despite their broken bodies, they held on to courage. Some smuggled messages out of the camp. Others refused to cooperate with their captors. Their bravery shone in a place designed to extinguish all hope. The memory of these experiments became one of Ravensbrück's darkest legacies. Long after the war ended, survivors would testify, their voices trembling but unbroken, determined that the world should never forget what had been done to them. Yet, the worst was not over. Beyond the hospital walls, Ravensbrück would soon reveal its most horrifying purpose: mass execution. Not all women at Ravensbrück surrendered to despair. Even in the darkest corners of the camp, resistance flickered. It came not in grand battles, but in whispers, glances, and tiny acts of defiance that carried enormous risk. The women who resisted knew that one mistake meant death, yet they chose courage over silence. Some smuggled scraps of paper hidden in hems of dresses, recording names of the dead so the outside world would one day know. Others memorized entire lists, keeping them alive in their minds when no pencil was allowed. Prisoners in the sewing workshops sometimes altered Nazi uniforms in subtle ways, misstitching seams, loosening threads, or hiding symbols of hope embroidered in secret. Every act was a reminder that their spirits could not be broken. The Polish women targeted in the medical experiments became central figures in this underground resistance. Despite their injuries and constant surveillance, they spread information among other prisoners, exposing the lies of the SS. They inspired others by refusing to bow even when bones in their legs were shattered. Their defiance was so strong that the guards nicknamed them the Rabbits, a cruel reminder of the experiments, but also a sign that they were being noticed for their courage. Secretly, women shared poems, songs, and prayers. Some taught languages or history, turning their barracks into makeshift classrooms. In these small lessons, they reminded one another of life beyond the fences. It was knowledge, not just food, that helped them survive. There were even attempts to smuggle messages to the outside world. Packages delivered by the Red Cross were sometimes used to slip coded notes. Though many were caught and executed, the information that made it out revealed the horrors of Ravensbrück to resistance networks across Europe. It showed that even here, in a camp designed to crush women's bodies and souls, humanity endured. But resistance came at a heavy cost. Women caught whispering, hiding scraps of paper, or even giving extra food to another prisoner could be dragged away for beatings or disappear forever. The SS understood that hope was as dangerous as weapons, and yet every time a prisoner chose to resist, even in silence, she declared that Ravensbrück could never fully win. By 1944, whispers of Nazi defeat reached the camp. Allied bombings shook the skies. The SS grew more paranoid, harsher, and crueler. Yet the women held on to a fragile truth. The war might end, and their voices might still be heard. But what awaited them when liberation finally came? Who among them would survive to see? It was still uncertain. After the liberation of Ravensbrück, a chilling truth emerged. The voices of its survivors were often silenced. In the chaos of post-war Europe, women who had endured the camp were rarely asked to testify or tell their stories. Many returned home only to face disbelief or indifference. Some nations saw them not as heroes, but as reminders of defeat and shame. The suffering of women in Ravensbrück became a hidden chapter in history, overshadowed by stories of larger male camps. Yet, evidence of what happened inside could not remain buried forever. Doctors who had experimented on prisoners tried to hide their crimes. Guards fled, changed names, and blended into society. But survivors carried the scars on their bodies, bones cut and shattered, organs damaged, health destroyed. When they spoke, they told of experiments that made them living skeletons, told of girls forced into prostitution by the SS, their youth stolen in silence. These voices revealed a cruelty that no photograph could fully capture. The Allies conducted trials after the war, known as the Ravensbrück trials. Several guards and doctors were sentenced to death, but many others escaped justice. Some continued medical careers, some lived quietly, and others even thrived. For decades, the story of Ravensbrück remained fragmented, rarely mentioned in history books. The silence was not accidental. Governments wanted to rebuild quickly, not dwell on the atrocities of female camps. The voices of women became inconvenient reminders of a past no one wanted to face. Still, survivors refused to be erased. They formed small groups, writing memoirs, speaking at schools, and demanding recognition. Slowly, the world began to listen. But by the time history acknowledged Ravensbrück, many survivors had already passed away, their stories untold. The silence that followed liberation was almost as cruel as the camp itself. Even now, historians argue that Ravensbrück reveals a unique cruelty in the Nazi system. The deliberate targeting of women not only as enemies, but as subjects for humiliation and degradation. It's unlike other camps. It was designed specifically to strip women of dignity, forcing them into roles of both victims and objects of exploitation. The silence of the world raises an unsettling question. If so many voices could be ignored for so long, how many stories remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered? Ravensbrück was not just a camp, it was a warning that cruelty can exist in places least expected, that silence allows evil to grow unchecked. And this silence leads us directly into the next chapter: how the memory of Ravensbrück has been preserved or erased by the generations that followed. There are moments in history when silence speaks louder than any scream. Ravensbrück was one of those places. The women inside lived in constant fear, yet there was also a strange kind of defiance that the SS guards could never erase. Some women refused to break even in the face of starvation, beatings, and death. Their rebellion was not always loud. Sometimes it was as simple as holding another prisoner's hand in the dark or whispering a prayer when they knew it could cost them their life. When Soviet forces advanced in 1945, chaos spread through the camp. The SS tried to cover their crimes, burning records, destroying evidence, and forcing prisoners into death marches. Thousands of women were driven into the forests, many collapsing from exhaustion along the way. But even in this final act of cruelty, there was resistance. Women held each other up, sharing scraps of bread, refusing to let the Nazis rob them of their humanity in those last days. Liberation came, but it was not the end of the nightmare. When the Soviets finally entered the camp in late April 1945, what they found was beyond belief. Starving women with hollow eyes staggered forward, some unable to stand. The crematorium was still smoldering, and bodies lay piled in ditches. The faces of Ravensbrück told the story. Women from over 30 countries, from every walk of life, reduced to shadows of themselves. Survivors later said they felt too weak to even celebrate freedom. They were free, but their voices carried the silence of the dead. One haunting detail remained. The children, mothers had been separated from their babies, young girls had been turned into test subjects, and countless pregnancies had been ended by force. Liberation meant survival, but it could not erase what had been stolen. The world did not immediately understand the scale of Ravensbrück. Unlike Auschwitz, it was not as widely known. For many survivors, silence became their prison long after the gates had opened. They carried the scars in their bodies and their memories, often too painful to share. Some women spoke out decades later, giving testimony that finally revealed the depth of the atrocities. Others never found the words. The climax of Ravensbrück is not in battles or explosions. It lies in the quiet strength of women who endured when everything was designed to destroy them. Their survival, their whispers of hope, and their refusal to completely surrender became the camp's final act of defiance. The silence of Ravensbrück still lingers, but it is not empty. It is filled with memory. It is filled with names that must never be forgotten. When the gates of Ravensbrück finally opened in 1945, silence lingered over the grounds like a ghost. Survivors stumbled out, many too weak to walk on their own. The world saw their hollow faces, their broken bodies, but it took years for the full story to surface. Ravensbrück was not just a prison, it was a factory of human suffering, a place where women's voices were stolen, their identities erased. Yet those who lived carried with them a duty to testify. Slowly in courtrooms and memoirs, survivors spoke about the horrors, the medical experiments, the forced labor, the hunger, and the executions. Their words painted a chilling picture of cruelty that history could no longer ignore. And through them, Ravensbrück stopped being just a name. It became a warning. But silence remained in many corners. Some perpetrators escaped justice, living quietly for decades after the war. For years, the story of Ravensbrück was overshadowed by other camps, its unique horror often left in the background. Only in recent decades has the world begun to fully recognize what happened within those walls. The legacy of Ravensbrück lies not in numbers, but in memory. Each woman held prisoner there was more than a victim. She was a mother, sister, a friend, a life cut short or forever scarred. Their courage to endure, even in the face of such darkness, shines like a fragile light against the vast shadow of war. Today, the camp remains as a memorial. Visitors walk its grounds, where the silence still feels heavy. Flowers rest where ashes once fell, and names are carved into stone to resist the erasure that the Nazis intended. Ravensbrück forces us to confront a difficult truth. War does not only destroy cities. An army set destroys the most vulnerable, especially women who are too often forgotten in history's telling. By remembering Ravensbrück, we refuse to let their suffering vanish. Because the true horror is not only what happened there, but what could happen again if silence wins over memory.